Ayatollah Ali Khamenei sat at a simple wooden desk in his private study, leaning forward as he read every word of President Trump's latest speech. The room was quiet except for the soft rustle of paper and the distant hum of a ceiling fan. His aides stood respectfully a few steps behind, watching him closely. For weeks, tensions between Iran and the United States had been rising like a slow storm on the horizon. Trump's promise of maximum pressure had brought new sanctions that hurt ordinary Iranians. Prices in the markets climbed. Businesses struggled, and many families worried about feeding their children. Khamenei understood how his people felt the weight of their anxiety in every line of that speech. He closed his eyes for a moment and remembered the times when Iran seemed more hopeful. When young people dreamed of studying abroad and starting new businesses, now many of those dreams were on hold. Khamenei thought about the gardeners in small towns who had to sell their tools just to buy basic food. He thought about the teachers who could not pay rent. He felt a deep responsibility to answer these threats in a way that gave hope without making things worse. His advisors had prepared long, detailed reports on possible responses. Some urged calm, others urged defiance. But Khamenei wanted something different. He wanted a message that would echo in every corner of Iran and reach beyond its borders. Outside the study, the city of Tehran moved on. Cars edged through crowded streets, and shopkeepers swept their doorsteps. Children in school uniforms laughed as they walked together under old plane trees. Friday prayers would be held soon in the Grand Mosque, and Khamenei planned to speak there. It was a sacred place where people from all walks of life gathered every week. More than just a mosque, it was a symbol of unity and faith. Khamenei knew that whatever he said from that pulpit would reach millions of ears at once. His aide, a calm man named Hassan, stepped forward with a fresh cup of tea. He placed it gently on the desk and bowed his head. "Supreme Leader, your speech is set to air in less than 2 hours," Hassan reminded him. Khamenei nodded and took the steaming cup. He sipped slowly, letting the warmth spread through him. Then he motioned for Hassan to bring the drafts of his own remarks. Papers fluttered as they were placed before him. 2 long pages of carefully chosen words, each line debated and tested. Khamenei skimmed them and then set them aside. He wanted to speak from his own heart, not just read words others had chosen. He reached for a clean sheet of paper and began to write in bold strokes. He recalled a verse from Persian poetry about bravery. He thought of the great kings and warriors whose names still inspired respect centuries later. He searched for a short phrase that carried power, but was easy to remember. His pen moved swiftly, and soon he had written a sentence that made him pause. He read it aloud in his quiet room. A lion doesn't ask for permission before roaring. He allowed himself a small smile. It was simple, but strong. It spoke of courage, strength, and unwillingness to bow down. It could be understood by anyone who heard it. As he finished, his aides gathered around to read what he had written, exchanged glances, then looked back at him. One by one, they nodded in approval. The phrase was short enough for a headline, and bold enough to catch the world's attention. In a matter of seconds, it would be on television screens, newspapers, and smartphones everywhere. They prepared the text for translation into English and other languages, ready to send it to state media. Then they left the room quietly, giving Khamenei a moment alone with his thoughts. He sat back and closed his eyes again. He knew that a direct reply to Trump would raise eyebrows in capitals around the world. Some might call it reckless. Others would praise his courage. But to him, words were a tool, just like any other. A well-timed phrase could lift a nation's spirit or change the course of a debate. He thought of the people listening to him in the mosque: farmers, factory workers, students, and elders. He wanted them to feel pride, but also to remember the work ahead. Pride alone could not fill empty stomachs or mend broken hospitals. He hoped that his bold line would unite his people and warn those in power abroad that Iran stood firm. In the hallway outside the study, the sound of footsteps grew louder. Staff prepared the Grand Mosque, arranging lights and adjusting microphones. Television crews tested their cameras. Volunteers handed out leaflets announcing the Supreme Leader's speech. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Some whispered prayers, others checked their watches. Everyone knew this moment mattered. Across Tehran, people paused their chores to tune in. Shops lowered their shutters temporarily, and taxi drivers turned down their radios to listen to the news. At exactly the right time, a voice announced on state television that the supreme leader would address the nation. Millions switched on. Their sets, in homes, apartments, and tea stalls, eyes turned to screens. Khamenei appeared on camera, dressed in plain robes and a black turban. His face was steady, his gaze calm. He began by greeting the worshippers and acknowledging their hardships. Then he spoke of Iran's long history, of its poetry and science, of its resilience in the face of invasion and isolation. He spoke in a clear, measured tone that showed respect for his audience. Finally, he paused and looked directly into the camera. His voice grew firmer as he uttered the line he had written. A lion doesn't ask for permission before roaring. In that moment, silence filled the screen as everyone held their breath. Then, the roar of applause broke out in the mosque, and cheers rose from television studios. Social media lit up as users shared the phrase, adding images and comments. Newspapers quickly ran the headline across their front pages. Even in distant cities, people quoted the line in cafes and offices back in his study. Khamenei watched the first reports come in. He saw faces lighting up, heard voices repeating his words. He felt a quiet satisfaction, but he knew this was only the first move. Words could inspire, but actions must follow. He set aside the cup of tea and stood up. It was time to plan the next steps: meetings with generals, talks with diplomats, and decisions that would shape the country's future. Yet he carried with him the memory of that moment, the moment when a simple phrase spoke as loud as a roar, and when a single sentence had the power to move the hearts of millions. The day of the speech dawned clear and bright over Tehran. The sun rose slowly, bathing the city in soft light. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps and opened their doors early to welcome morning customers. Street vendors arranged fresh fruit on wooden carts. Children in neat uniforms climbed onto crowded buses, chattering about school. But beneath the ordinary bustle lay a tense excitement. Word had spread that Ayatollah Khamenei would speak at the Grand Mosque today about the growing tensions with the United States. People spoke in hushed tones as they passed each other on the sidewalks. This was not an ordinary Friday. Many felt that whatever Khamenei would say could change the mood in the country and perhaps beyond its borders. Inside the mosque courtyard, volunteers hurried to place extra chairs for worshippers. The courtyard was large, with stone tiles worn smooth by generations of feet. Tall pillars rose up around the edges, and colorful tile work covered the walls. In the center, a simple wooden stage had been set up. On it stood a single podium, with microphones ready for the leader's voice. Young men in green vests carried crates of bottled water and handed them to mosque staff, who placed them on small tables for anyone who needed a drink. Women wearing scarves in soft colors formed lines outside the women's entrance, adjusting their scarves and smoothing their clothes. Everyone wanted to look neat and respectful. By mid-morning, thousands had gathered. Some sat on the ground, legs crossed, looking toward the stage. Others stood in small groups, talking quietly about how the economy felt heavy with worry. Some parents held their children's hands, telling them to be patient and listen closely. An old man with a weathered face and gentle eyes held a worn Quran to his chest. He nodded at younger worshippers and offered blessings for peace. A schoolteacher nearby checked her watch, then smiled at her students, reminding them this was history in the making. The air was filled with a mix of anticipation and calm faith. Occasionally a breeze rustled through the courtyard, carrying the scent of jasmine from nearby gardens. The noise of traffic felt distant here, replaced by murmurs of conversation and the soft rustle of prayer rugs. All around, banners in green, white, and red hung from balcony railings and lampposts. They read simple phrases of unity and strength, in Farsi, reminding Iranians that they shared a common purpose. Inside the mosque's main hall, the mood was even more focused. Pillars arched overhead like the branches of a great tree. Light filtered in through stained glass windows, casting patterns on the marble floor. Hundreds of people knelt on their prayer rugs, faces bowed. Many carried small notebooks, ready to write down any words that might guide them later. A hush settled as the prayer leaders began the rituals of Friday prayer. The voices rose and fell in measured cadences, calling worshippers to focus their minds and hearts. Even the walls seemed to listen. Upstairs, behind the scenes, preparations moved swiftly. Technicians tested sound equipment, adjusting microphones so that every word would carry clearly. Cameramen set up their tripods, aligning their lenses with the podium. Journalists checked their notes, ready to record the Supreme Leader's response to President Trump's speech. Dressed in black jackets and ties, they represented many countries: Iran, of course, but also Russia, China, France, and the United States itself. Each was curious to capture the tone and content of Khamenei's words. Would he threaten war? Would he offer peace? Would he propose dialogue? Speculation ran high. In a small room off to the side, Khamenei's closest aides waited. They wore simple clothes and dark colors. Their faces were solemn but focused. Papers lay neatly on a table: talking points, translations, and briefings on economic conditions. One aide held a smartphone, streaming an English-language news channel. They watched as anchors debated the meaning of earlier statements from Iranian officials, but the aides had their own priorities. They checked watches and whispered quick updates. The leader would arrive in 5 minutes, then 10. They made sure that no detail was overlooked. Outside that room, the ground shook slightly as the Supreme Leader's black limousine rolled into the courtyard. A cluster of security personnel stepped out first, scanning the crowd. Then Khamenei emerged. He wore his plain robes and black turban, his face calm and unreadable. He walked slowly, supported by a simple wooden cane. Yet each step seemed firm and sure. Worshippers rose to their feet as he passed, bowing their heads respectfully. Some offered soft salams under their breath. Young student in the front row raised his hand in greeting, but stayed silent as Khamenei moved past. When Khamenei reached the stage, he paused and looked across the crowd. His eyes met those of farmers, students, workers, and elders. He seemed to take their presence into himself, drawing strength from their faith. The crowd fell silent. Even the whispers of the wind felt stilled. A technician handed him a copy of his prepared remarks, but he shook his head and held out his hand for a pen. He would speak from the page he had written himself. He opened his notes at a marked page and cleared his throat. His voice was steady, low, and carried easily through the microphones. He began by thanking those who had come, acknowledging the sacrifices made under sanctions. He spoke of the difficult choices that ordinary families faced each day, from rising food prices to shortages of medicine. His words were gentle, yet direct. He told a brief story of a schoolteacher in a small town who had borrowed books because she could no longer afford new ones. He spoke of a farmer who sold his tractor tire just to buy flour. These stories made the crowd nod and murmur. Then he shifted to the bigger picture. He spoke of Iran's history of resilience. From ancient kings who built great cities to modern revolutionaries who overthrew dictators. He reminded the worshippers that Iran had faced tough times before and survived. He spoke of science and art, of poets who wrote verses of hope, and painters who depicted gardens of paradise. He said that the spirit of the nation lay in its people's courage and creativity. Once he had painted that picture, he paused. He looked straight ahead and his tone grew firmer. We spoke of the recent speech by President Trump, where Trump had threatened to tighten sanctions and warned of serious consequences if Iran did not back down. Khamenei said he understood the concerns of world leaders who worried about security, but he also said that threats would not break his people's will. He asked rhetorically if a nation built on thousands of years of culture could be bullied into silence. The crowd listened in rapt attention, their eyes fixed on him. Then Khamenei stood a little taller, and in that quiet moment he spoke the line that had been on his mind for days. A lion doesn't ask for permission before roaring. The words echoed through the hall like a drumbeat. A hush fell, as though the world outside had stopped for a second. Then the sound of applause rose up, soft at first, then growing louder. People stood and clapped, some raising their hands in salute. Cameras clicked, and reporters scribbled furiously. In that instant, it seemed as if the world held its breath. The phrase was simple but powerful. It spoke of courage, pride, and unbowed spirit. It spoke more than words of diplomacy ever could. The mosque filled with energy as worshippers repeated the line among themselves. Outside, the courtyard erupted in cheers and echoes of the lion's roar. Vendors paused to listen, and passers-by stopped to watch. After the applause, Khamenei's voice returned to a gentler tone. He urged his listeners to keep working for their country's future. He said that unity and faith were more important, now than ever. He reminded them that words needed action to carry real change. He asked them to help each other, to share what they had, and to look after the weak and the poor. His final words were a prayer for peace and guidance. When he stepped down from the stage, the crowd parted to let him pass. He blessed the worshippers, and they blessed him in return. As he walked back to his limousine, some people followed him with their eyes, still humming the line about the lion. Others turned to one another and whispered, wondering what the next days would bring. But in that moment, most felt a spark of hope, a sense that their leader had spoken directly to them and to the world. They carried the echo of those words in their hearts as they returned to their daily lives, forever changed by hearing a bold reply in a time of worry and fear. The roar of the Supreme Leader's words did not fade with the applause. Instead, it seemed to echo endlessly through the streets of Tehran and far beyond. Within minutes, state television replayed the moment again and again, freezing on his steady gaze and the simple phrase that had cut through weeks of tense talk. In coffee shops, shop windows, and classrooms, people clustered around small screens to hear his voice once more. Many whispered the line among themselves, testing its power on their tongues. Outside the capital, in dusty towns and mountainous villages, families gathered around radios, nodding at the gravity in his tone. Even those who had felt hopeless under the weight of sanctions sensed a spark of pride and strength. Meanwhile, digital screens around the world lit up with translations. Journalists in New York, London, and Dubai pored over transcripts, debating whether the phrase signaled a shift in Iran's stance. Headlines varied from defiant Iran roars back to lion metaphor sparks debate. On social media, users in dozens of languages posted images of a lion breaking free from chains, superimposed with the Supreme Leader's words. Some praised the metaphor as a sign of unbending courage. Others worried it might push the United States toward harsher measures. International relations experts scrambled to update their briefings, weighing whether this roar was merely rhetorical or a prelude to bolder action. In Washington, analysts in the Situation Room gathered for an emergency meeting. One diplomat pointed to the televised clip, replaying the phrase for colleagues. A military advisor frowned, worried that adversaries might take the lion image literally. A senior official reminded everyone that metaphors can carry hidden meanings. Perhaps roaring suggested stronger support for allied groups in the region, or new tests of missile defenses. Others argued that it was simply a way to unite Iranians around their leader, with no real intent to escalate. They debated how and whether to respond without giving the words more weight. Back in Tehran, reactions were complex. In crowded bazaars, merchants resumed their haggling but did so with glances at small handheld radios. Many expressed relief that their leader spoke firmly. They said they felt seen, as if someone understood their struggles. A tea vendor in a narrow alley sold cups to passers-by who said they felt a renewed sense of unity. At the same time, there was an undercurrent of anxiety. Some worried that a loud roar might bring a fiercer counterattack or a tighter economic pressure. A mother buying bread for her children whispered to a neighbor, "I hope his roar does not wake up a sleeping storm." Wondered if symbols of power could also magnify danger. In media centers across Europe, the quote spawned talk shows and opinion columns. A French newspaper wrote that the metaphor harked back to Iran's ancient imperial past, evoking kings who ruled with both wisdom and strength. A British commentator warned that such imagery could inflame tensions, urging political leaders to seek dialogue before emotions flew too high. In Berlin, think tanks held panels to analyze potential outcomes. Would Iran test new satellites or missiles as proof of its roar? Would allies respond by tightening alliances? Scenario carried. Risks, but none seemed as vivid or immediate as the simple idea of a lion's roar heard without a plea for permission. Inside Iran's universities, students met in coffee houses to dissect the moment. Some wrote essays comparing the phrase to slogans of past revolutions, describing how a short line can become a symbol. One student sketched on a napkin a lion's head against the backdrop of the Iranian flag, captioned with the words. Another proposed printing the phrase on posters and distributing them in refugee camps to lift spirits. Yet a few cautioned that grand words must be matched by careful action. They formed small study groups to discuss economics and diplomacy, deciding to host lectures on how Iran might strengthen its own industries and negotiate better deals abroad. For them, the roar was a call not only to stand tall, but to learn and grow. In nearby countries, diplomats in capitals like Baghdad and Ankara watched the ripple effects. They recognized that even a rhetorical flourish could sway regional balances. Some worried that pro-Iranian groups might feel emboldened, while others thought Iraqi leaders would seek to distance themselves from any perceived aggression. Turkish officials wondered if they should open new back channels to reassure Iran's neighbors that the roar was symbolic rather than a threat. They prepared communiques emphasizing dialogue and inviting Iran to regional talks on security and trade. Quiet messages flew between embassies, each side clarifying that no one sought fresh conflict even as tensions simmered. As the evening fell in Tehran, the Grand Mosque courtyard was empty but still alive in memory. Moonlight bathed the stone tiles where thousands had gathered. A young poet visited the empty stage and bent down to touch the spot where Khamenei had stood. He closed his eyes and whispered the phrase again, feeling its weight and echo. He thought about how words shape reality, how a lion's roar can rally a crowd or startle an enemy. He resolved to write a poem capturing both the strength and the fragility of such moments. Around him, the city prepared for the night, its lights flickering on, its pulse steady yet changed. In the following days, the phrase settled into everyday life. Bus drivers repeated it to passengers. Tailors stitched it into the hems of jackets as secret reminders of national resolve. Even children in playgrounds mimicked roars, laughing as they pretended to be lions. For many Iranians, the words became a sign that they were not alone in their hardship. They felt their leader stood with them, roaring on their behalf. And for the world beyond Iran's borders, the simple sentence served as a reminder that in the arena of nations, sometimes the truest roar comes not from weapons or armies, but from words that find the right moment and the right heart to echo through. News of the supreme leader's bold words spread like wildfire through Tehran's morning air. As the first light touched the rooftops, state television began its round-the-clock coverage. Anchors in crisp suits spoke in measured tones, replaying the clip of Khamenei declaring that a lion doesn't ask for permission before roaring. Behind the cameras, technicians hastily queued up maps of the region and charts showing trade flows. In one control room, a producer pointed at a monitor and barked, "Bring up those satellite images." Over in the studio, another anchor leaned forward and turned to the guest pundit, asking, "What does this mean for our security?" Outside the television building, delivery riders paused their scooters to watch the screens mounted on the walls. Shopkeepers stepped back into their doorways and pressed fingers to their lips as they listened. Many felt a swell of pride at hearing their leader speak with such firmness. They whispered to one another that at last someone had given voice to their anger over years of hardship. Yet behind that pride, there was a quieter worry. Would this roar draw fresh attacks? Would new sanctions make daily life even harder? A young fruit seller, stacking apples in neat rows, sighed as he thought of rising prices again. In newspaper offices across the city, journalists scrambled to file stories before the presses rolled. One reporter raced down a hallway, clutching a yellow legal pad filled with quotes from interviews. He had spoken to a grandmother in Isfahan who said Khamenei's words made her feel safe for the first time in months. Another reporter sat at his desk, translating the phrase into English, French, and Arabic to send to international news wires. Editors peered over their glasses at bold headlines, defiant roar unites a nation, and Iran's lion speaks. They debated whether to run an opinion column exploring historical echoes of lion imagery in Persian culture. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the Situation Room was a hive of quiet tension. A senior diplomat tapped his pen nervously against a folder. He had spent years negotiating delicate deals, yet these simple words now seemed to carry more weight than any treaty. A military advisor spread out maps across the table, pointing to missile launch sites near the border. Another official warned that Iran's allies might interpret the phrase as a signal to step up their own actions. They debated whether to issue a public statement or perhaps to wait and see how events unfolded. In the end, they agreed on a brief White House memo that called the remark unfortunate and reaffirmed America's commitment to peace through strength. In European capitals, ambassadors held hastily arranged conference calls. In London, an ambassador to the United Kingdom cautioned that the roar should not be taken as proof of imminent aggression. He reminded colleagues that rhetoric often outpaces reality. In Paris, a diplomat suggested sending a message offering discreet talks with Iran's foreign ministry, hoping to calm frayed nerves. Berlin weighed in by proposing a joint statement calling for restraint on all sides. Meanwhile, in Brussels, the European Union's foreign policy chief drafted a letter inviting Iran to participate in an upcoming security forum. The aim was clear: channel the energy of the moment into dialogue rather than confrontation. In Iran, the response among citizens was a tapestry of emotion. In a small apartment in Shiraz, a retired schoolteacher and her husband gathered around a radio. They held hands as they repeated the phrase out loud, smiling at each other through tears. They said they felt seen and respected, as if someone finally spoke truth to power. In contrast, a young engineer in Mashhad watched the coverage with a furrowed brow. He worried that the roar might lead to fresh travel bans, keeping him from a conference he had long planned. He closed his eyes and wished that strong words could be matched by wise plans. In a cafe near Tehran University, students gathered around a single phone streaming the speech. They passed the phone from hand to hand, analyzing each nuance of Khamenei's tone. One student sketched the phrase in neat letters on a napkin and passed it around. They debated whether the line was meant more for domestic pride or as a direct challenge to the United States. A philosophy major said he saw echoes of poetry in the comparison to a lion, while a political science student insisted it was pure strategy, a way to unify the population before tough negotiations ahead. At the American embassy in Ankara, Turkish officials peered at feeds of the speech. They knew that Turkey had close ties to both Washington and Tehran, and they felt the pressure of their role as a bridge between two uneasy partners. The ambassador called a meeting with senior staff to discuss options. Should they offer to mediate quietly? Should they express concern that the roar might destabilize the region? They drafted talking points emphasizing Turkey's wish for calm and cooperation. Outside the embassy gates, a handful of protesters held signs reading "No to War and Dialogue, Not Roar," reminding passersby that not everyone welcomed such forceful language. In back rooms of Iran's own foreign ministry, careful minds parsed every possible implication. They laid out scenarios. If the United States tightened sanctions further, how should Iran respond? Could they offer concessions on low-risk issues like cultural exchanges or environmental projects? Should they beef up support for allies in Lebanon and Yemen to show that the roar was more than words? Councils met late into the night, drinking endless cups of tea and debating the best balance of defiance and diplomacy. Nobody wanted to be blamed for missteps if tensions spiked. Across the Persian Gulf in Dubai's financial district, traders glanced at headlines as they monitored oil prices. The price crept up slightly on the news, reflecting fears of instability. But some analysts said the market reaction was modest after all. A metaphor alone rarely shifts real flows of oil. Still, a senior fund manager paused before placing a trade, reminding himself that even rhetorical moves can ripple into markets when people fear the worst. In Tehran's Grand Bazaar, where merchants had cheered earlier, the echo of the roar lingered in the alleys. A carpet seller wound strands of silk onto a loom as he recalled the scene at the mosque. He said to customers, "Our leader spoke. For us today, A jewelry maker tapped gold coins on an anvil, thinking about his daughters and what their future might hold. He paused at the sound of passing children reciting the phrase in the schoolyard, "A lion doesn't ask for permission." Before roaring, he wondered whether that roar would protect them or simply stir more trouble. As night fell over the city, the lights of Tehran glowed softly against the dark sky. In homes across the nation, families ate dinner and shared reflections on the day's events. Some felt strengthened by the bold message. Others felt anxious at the possibility of new dangers. Yet almost everyone agreed that they had witnessed a moment of history. In living rooms and public squares, people repeated the line to one another, as if testing its power and weight. The phrase had become more than a piece of rhetoric, was now part of the nation's story. And so the roar settled into memory, living on in heads and hearts. The world beyond watched in cautious silence, unsure whether the lion would roar again or settle back into its den. But for a time, those words carried the force of a gathering storm, uniting some, worrying others. And reminding all that, in the delicate dance of nations, even a single sentence can shape the steps of many. In the days that followed, life in Iran carried on under a new light. The echo of the supreme leader's words still lingered in every corner of the country, as if a soft but powerful wind had passed through. In homes, offices, and schools, television, and radio replayed the phrase, "A lion doesn't ask for permission," before roaring, alongside images of the Grand Mosque and crowds who had witnessed the moment. Some people smiled with pride. Others shook their heads with worry. But nearly everyone felt that something had shifted. In a small workshop on the outskirts of Tehran, a metal worker named Reza tapped gently on a brass plate, smoothing its edges. He had been asked by a local craft cooperative to engrave Khamenei's words on commemorative plaques for mosques and community centers. As he worked, Reza thought of his own life, how he had struggled to support his family when sanctions made materials scarce, how he had saved scraps of metal for months to repair his aging tools. Now, as he carved the simple sentence into shiny brass, he felt a sense of purpose. He imagined the plaques hanging in dusty village halls, reminding people of strength in the hardest times. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of a university library, a doctoral student named Sarah pored over history books. Her focus was cultural symbols, and she saw the lion metaphor as part of a long tradition. She wrote notes comparing the roaring lion to Persian carpet motifs and to ancient inscriptions on palace walls. To her, the supreme leader's phrase was not only a political message, but a reminder of Iran's rich heritage. She planned to include an analysis of this moment in her thesis, arguing that simple words can carry centuries of meaning when they touch the right nerve. Across town, a middle-aged teacher named Mr. Farhad prepared his lesson plan for a class of 6th graders. He decided to use the incident as a chance to talk about communication and courage. He wrote questions on the board. What makes a phrase powerful? How can leaders use words to inspire? He asked the students to draw pictures of things that roar: lions, thunder, the sea, and then write their own short slogans. The children giggled and shared their ideas, some bold, some funny. One girl wrote, "A river doesn't ask for directions before flowing." Another boy penned, "A tree doesn't ask for light before growing." Through their simple work, they learned that words can shape how people think and feel. Not far from the school, an elderly grandmother named Amina gathered with her grandchildren for their evening meal. They sat on cushions around a low table, piled with rice, stew, and fresh herbs. As they ate, the youngest child asked about the lion quote he kept hearing at school. Amina smiled gently and explained that sometimes, when a leader sees his people weighed down by troubles, he speaks a bold phrase to remind them of their own power. She told them stories from her youth of times, when communities came together to rebuild after floods. When villagers saved seeds for planting even in lean years, she said, that hope and courage live inside people, ready to roar when they need strength. In diplomatic circles abroad, the conversation gradually cooled. After initial jitters, many governments concluded that the roar was more symbolic than an immediate threat. Quiet talks resumed as envoys met in neutral capitals to discuss regional issues. Some offered to open back channels, emphasizing shared interests in trade, climate, and cultural exchange. A European mediator visited Tehran, meeting with Iranian officials over tea and pastries, discussing possible steps to ease tensions. They spoke of academic partnerships and joint projects on water management that could build trust for larger talks. The roar, it seemed, had broken the ice of fear and forced everyone to speak anew. Back in Tehran, the Grand Mosque courtyard stood, empty once more, but its stones still seemed to remember the applause and cheers. A janitor swept the fallen leaves, humming a tune he heard at the gathering. He paused at the edge of the stage, his broom resting on the stone, and whispered the line in the quiet air. For him, the words were a promise that his efforts, however small, mattered, in that one day, when circumstances allowed, he would see his grandchildren studying in better schools, with books and tools they could afford. In distant villages beyond the mountains, farmers worked their fields under a hot sun. They listened to a crackling radio speaker tied to a tractor frame. When the phrase replayed, they paused their plowing to wipe sweat from their brows and share a look of resolve. They felt that they too were part of a larger story, one in which their harvests and prayers counted toward their nation's strength. In the evenings, they gathered around a small fire, sipping tea and talking about how they might adapt to changing seasons, always mindful that resilience grows from both words and deeds. Even within Iran's own corridors of power, the moment led to hard choices. Officials debated economic plans to ease sanctions pain, working on ways to increase local manufacturing of medicines and agricultural supplies. They drafted proposals to expand internet access so that remote areas could learn new skills and trade online. They met with community leaders to listen to real needs rather than relying on distant reports. Some admitted that the roar had been a call to action inside the government, as much as outside it, in a parked car near the embassy district. A foreign journalist named Emma wrote her dispatch for an international newspaper. She described the lion metaphor, explained its cultural weight, and quoted voices from both fear and pride. As she wrote the final lines, she realized that the story would not end with a flash of headlines. Instead, it would weave itself into the narratives of many people, craftsmen, students, teachers, farmers, diplomats, finding meaning in those simple words. On a warm evening, under a sky full of stars, a young couple walked hand in hand along a quiet street. They passed a small bookstore with a window display quoting the Supreme Leader's line, printed on a banner above stacks of new volumes on Iranian history and poetry. The husband paused and read the banner aloud. His wife smiled, leaning on his shoulder, and said that she felt proud of her homeland. He replied that now they both understood that courage need not be loud. Sometimes a single clear note can carry farther than any roar. They continued their walk, carrying the words in their hearts. And so, over time, the lion doesn't ask for permission. Before roaring became part of daily life and inspiration for some, caution for others, but a reminder to all that words can change how people see themselves in the world. It did not solve every problem, nor did it end every fear. But it gave many Iranians a spark of unity when they felt divided. And it reminded the world that strength and dignity can come through speech as much as through force. In the quiet of his study weeks later, Ayatollah Khamenei read a report on these developments. He saw stories of plaques, poems, classrooms, and harvest fields. He read analyses from diplomats and essays by students abroad. He allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing that the phrase had done more than rally crowds. It had touched individual hearts and set in motion conversations that might one day lead to lasting change. Then he turned his gaze back to the tasks ahead, aware that leadership is not a single roar, but a continuing journey of words and actions together.